The wind screamed through the cracks in the door, carrying with it a biting chill that rattled the glass panes as if determined to shatter them. Laura sat motionless in her worn armchair, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the lake outside. Flashes of lightning clawed across the horizon, casting eerie, fractured light through the empty villa. Each fleeting burst heightened the knot of fear in her chest. It was in one such flash that she saw it, a figure standing under the porch roof, shadowed and utterly still, watching. "Elliot," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's relentless howl. There was no reply. The wind answered her instead, its mocking gusts pressing against the walls like unseen hands. Her breath came shallow as she stood, her trembling legs barely supporting her. Fear churned with something deeper inside her, something unnamed. Step by step, she moved toward the door, her heart pounding louder than the storm's fury. When she pulled the door open, the wind clawed its way in, icy and cruel, laced with fine needles of rain. There he was. Elliot stood in the doorway, his sweater soaked, water dripping from his hair as it clung to his brow. His eyes, piercing and unyielding, fixed on her, holding a gravity that made her want to turn away, yet left her unable to. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, his voice low, teetering on the edge of being lost to the storm. "It's not safe for you." Laura froze, a lump in her throat cutting off any coherent response. "Not safe," she echoed, forcing a hollow laugh into the air, trying to mask the ache beneath it. "I'm safer than you think, Elliot. I came here to hide, not to face anything." He stepped forward. The storm at his back seemed inconsequential compared to the presence he commanded. "Hide," he said, his voice softer but no less intense. "You think you can hide forever. What you feel, what we feel, it doesn't just go away, Laura." His words struck her like a physical blow, leaving her stunned, her feet seeming to sink into the floor. Another crack of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating his face. His eyes burned with a mix of anguish and resolve, so raw, so undeniable. She wanted to retreat, slam the door, and shut him and everything else out. But her body betrayed her. She stood frozen, as though the storm outside had seeped into her very core, sweeping away every shred of reason. "Elliot, you don't know what you're saying," she murmured, the tremor in her voice exposing the war she fought within. "You know I do," he said, stepping closer, close enough she could see the raindrops glistening in his hair. "I've waited too long for you to see me, Laura. For you to see who I really am. Not just his son." A sudden violent gust slammed the door behind her, the sharp noise jolting her, but not enough to break whatever spell Elliot cast over her. The storm raged on, but it felt quieter now compared to the tempest roaring between them. The sharp bang echoed through the room, shattering the fragile quiet. Laura flinched, her breath hitching, but Elliot's unwavering gaze sliced through her. Something between them had shifted. No, it had fractured long ago, and tonight there was no escaping it. The storm wasn't just outside. It was here, and it was devouring them whole. "Come inside, Elliot. You'll catch a cold," she said, her voice thinner than she intended. The words broke the oppressive silence, and yet when he stepped across the threshold, she knew the door she had just opened wasn't the one keeping out the rain. She had crossed into dangerous territory, into a place she'd sworn never to enter again. The rain hissed against the windows, whispering memories she had buried deep but could no longer silence. Laura sat at the kitchen table, her fingers clenched around a mug that had grown as cold as the air between them. The dim overhead light bathed the room in a hollow glow, the shadows waltzing over her face, revealing the exhaustion carved by time, solitude, and old wounds. The faint creak of the wooden floor behind her sliced through her thoughts like a blade. She turned swiftly, her pulse quickening, to see Elliot standing there, drops of rain still clinging to his dark hair. He looked at her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, forcing her voice to sound casual. But it stumbled, betraying the storm swirling within her. Elliot shrugged, his eyes hooded with something unreadable. "Hard to sleep with rain like this. What about you?" "Another restless night." She hesitated, the answer heavy on her tongue. But the silence stretched between them, taut and frayed. Finally, she said, "I think sometimes it's not the rain that keeps you awake." Her words hum in the air, fragile and yet cutting, the weight of their truth palpable. Elliot didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, pulled out the chair across from her, and lowered himself into it, his gaze locked on hers. He studied her, peeling back the layers she had tried so desperately to guard. "Are you always like this?" he asked, his voice low, but there was an edge to it, a quiet challenge that sent her heart hammering. "Keeping everything bottled up, never saying what you really feel?" The question hit her like a thunderclap. Her eyes widened, her grip on the mug tightening as if it could anchor her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her tone sharp but cracking beneath the weight of his words. "I think you do," he murmured, his voice steady, calm, too calm. "You act like everything's fine, like none of it touches you. But no one's that strong, Laura. No one can be so alone and still be okay." His words cut through her defenses, and she felt her breath catch. She wanted to keep her grip firm, to keep herself intact, but the cracks were too deep and too old. "Elliot, some things are better left unsaid," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Some things, they don't need to be understood." Elliot leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table, his expression softening, but his words sharpening. "And what happens when you never say them? How do you live with it? How do you keep it all inside without breaking?" The question burrowed into her, unearthing a cascade of memories she had long buried. She saw herself as she once was, a woman filled with ambition, glowing with dreams and stories she had yearned to tell. But then there was Ethan. His voice, cold and unyielding, echoed through her thoughts. "Writing is just a foolish distraction," he had said, his dismissal crushing something vital within her. She had packed her dreams away, hidden them deep, and molded herself into the image Eden had demanded. A perfect wife by his standards. But it had never been enough. Despite all her sacrifices, Eden had left her to pick through the ruins of the life she had once believed in. And now, sitting here under the dim light with Elliot holding a mirror to the truth she had tried to forget, she realized the walls she had built were crumbling. The storm outside wasn't nearly as unforgiving as the one raging within her. Laura froze, her breath caught like a fragile whisper in the charged air. Elliot's gaze bore into her, steady and unyielding, pulling her ruthlessly back into the present. "You don't know what I've been through," she said at last, her voice cracking with the weight of truths she had never dared to speak aloud. "You wouldn't understand, Elliot." "Maybe not," he replied softly, the gentleness of his tone a sharp contrast to the piercing intent in his eyes. "But I do know what it feels like, the sting of being abandoned, dismissed, forgotten. It doesn't fade, Laura. It festers. It grows. Until it devours you whole." His words cut through her like a blade, a stark truth she wasn't prepared to face. Her defenses faltered, her composure slipping as she stared into his eyes etched with his own loss, his mother's absence, his father's neglect. But beneath the ache was something more, a yearning, raw and vulnerable, for connection. A connection she was terrified she couldn't give. "You have to understand, Elliot," she began, though her words felt hollow even as they left her lips. "We all carry our own burdens." "And you. What about you?" Elliot's voice didn't waver. His gaze didn't break. "Are you even living, Laura? Or are you just like me, just surviving?" She inhaled sharply, the question stealing the breath from her lungs. He was right. Somewhere deep within, she knew he was right. She wasn't living. She hadn't been for a long time. She was clinging to a life that had slipped through her fingers long ago. And now, here he was with his piercing blue eyes and unwavering voice, forcing her to confront every painful truth she had buried. The rain outside grew heavier, its relentless rhythm drumming against the windows like a heartbeat, erratic and cruel. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low guttural warning that she stubbornly ignored. It was as though the storm mirrored the chaos within her, a tempest threatening to pull her under. And yet part of her wondered if she even wanted to fight anymore. Elliot broke the silence, stepping further into the room. His presence was magnetic, his movements precise, as though he owned every inch of the space. Moisture clung to him, the dampness of his soaked shirt and jeans almost defiant, but he didn't seem to notice or care. When he set his umbrella down, she caught the briefest glimpse of something feral in his expression, something wild and unresolved. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," Laura murmured, her voice trembling under the suffocating tension. It felt as though the walls around her were closing in, trapping her in place. "And you shouldn't bury yourself here," Elliot shot back, his tone sharp with quiet defiance. "Why do you always sit like this, Laura? Like you're waiting for something to happen, but too afraid to make it happen." She flinched, the impact of his words hitting her as if the storm outside had found its way into the room. The dim light of the table lamp flickered over her features, casting weary shadows that felt heavier than her own growing silence. She didn't have an answer, perhaps because deep down, she wasn't sure if there was anything left to say. Laura froze as Elliot's piercing stare bore into her, dismantling the carefully constructed walls she had spent years fortifying. It was as if he could see everything, every secret she had buried, every fear she refused to name. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice faltering despite her best efforts to steady it. Elliot took a slow step closer, his presence an unrelenting force that pressed against her already fragile defenses. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, his voice calm but laced with an urgency that tightened the air between them. "You know it better than anyone. But you're scared, too scared to admit it." "Stop, Elliot," Laura snapped, louder than she intended, her voice cracking under the strain. But her protest only seemed to solidify his resolve. He didn't move, his unwavering gaze pinning her in place. "You don't know what you're saying," she added, desperation creeping into her tone. "And what about you? Do you even know what you're doing?" Elliot tilted his head slightly, his words cutting through her objections like a blade. Yet there was something else, something tender and aching that weighed on every syllable. "Since the day I stepped into your life, I've seen it. You're not happy, Laura. You pretend, you avoid, but I can't pretend I don't see it anymore." Panic clawed at her chest. She turned on her heel, desperate to escape the conversation, barreling out of her control. Her steps toward the shadowed hallway felt shaky and incomplete, and before she could put any distance between them, Elliot's hand closed around her wrist, not harshly, but with a firmness that stopped her cold. "Laura," he said softly, her name leaving his lips in a way she'd never heard before. It was stripped bare of formality, filled instead with something deep and raw. His voice was quieter now, intimate, as though he were offering a confession. "You're not the only one who feels abandoned. I do too, and I can't keep pretending you don't matter to me." His words crashed over her like thunder, leaving her too stunned to respond. Turning back slowly, her trembling eyes locked onto his. Elliot's deep blue gaze shimmered under the dim haze of the storm outside, carrying a vulnerability that made her insides ache. Anguish, longing, an unrelenting truth she wasn't ready to face. "You don't understand," Laura whispered, her voice breaking. "We can't, we're not supposed to. But you feel it too, don't you?" Elliot countered, never breaking eye contact. You don't have to say it. I already know. A crack of lightning split the night, illuminating the room in a sudden burst of silver light. It flickered over his face, etched with defiance and something too fragile to name. Between them, the space seemed smaller, charged with something dangerous and unspoken. She should have stepped back, closed the door on whatever this was before it could spiral any further. But her body betrayed her. Her feet remained anchored to the spot, her resolve washing away like the rain streaking the windows. Before she could speak, before she could think, Elliot leaned closer. His lips brushed hers, tentative and measured, as if giving her one last chance to retreat. She didn't. His warmth consumed her, his touch trembling with quiet desperation. And for one reckless, perilous moment, Laura surrendered. She allowed herself to forget everything, the rules, the consequences, the years of restraint. For that moment, she chose the pull of the gravity between them. Laura gave in to Elliot's touch, losing herself in a moment that erased responsibility, guilt, and reality. When they pulled apart, silence filled the room. Elliot's gaze lingered, intense and weighted with emotion, as Laura's breath quickened and her chest tightened. "What have we done?" she murmured, her voice trembling as her eyes dropped to the floor. "Something we can't deny," Elliot replied with steady resolve. "You can keep running, Laura, but you can't keep denying this." The words struck her like a weight, suffocating and undeniable. Without another word, Laura turned and hurried to her bedroom, her steps unsteady. She shut the door behind her, leaning against it as though she had just escaped a storm she wasn't sure she wanted to survive. Her heart pounded relentlessly. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows in a ferocious symphony, but the tempest within Laura was far greater, threatening to undo everything she had built to protect herself. The walls she had carefully constructed were crumbling, and she couldn't decide whether she had the strength, or the will, to rebuild them. The rain's roar merged with the unease brewing in her chest. She curled up on the old armchair in the dimly lit living room, hands clutching the hem of her dress as if letting go would release an uncontrollable flood of emotions. Memories of Elliot lingered, sharp and unyielding, like a wound refusing to heal. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, deliberate and firm. Laura's heart sank as her gaze met Claire's, the one person she trusted implicitly. Claire stood in the doorway, her piercing eyes scanning Laura before drifting toward the staircase that led to Elliot's room. Without a word, she entered, placing her bag on the table and pouring herself a cup of tea, every movement precise and purposeful. "Laura," Claire finally said, her voice calm but laced with an unspoken edge. "You look like you've just weathered a storm. Is there something you want to tell me?" Laura bit her lip, an inner struggle brewing as she tried to hold herself together. The relentless storm mirrored Laura's turmoil. Claw's probing gaze pierced through, her quiet words cutting deeper than any accusation. "What are you hiding, Laura?" she asked, sipping her tea, not breaking eye contact. Caught off guard, Laura was pinned by the weight of the question. Before she could muster an excuse, Claw leaned in, her voice sharp. "I saw Elliot leaving here last night. Do you care to explain?" Laura's silence betrayed her, her carefully constructed facade unraveling. "Elliot is Ethan's son," Claw pressed, her tone tinged with bitter disappointment. "This isn't just reckless, Laura. It's destructive." Their confrontation was interrupted by footsteps on the staircase. Elliot appeared, his pale face revealing he'd heard everything. "Is this what I am to you?" he asked, his voice loaded with hurt. "A mistake or an escape from your miserable life?" Laura fumbled for words, but Elliot turned away, bitterness marking his every step as he disappeared into the storm. Claw, observing the shattering moment, resolutely withdrew. The sound of the closing door echoed like a funeral bell. Left alone, Laura struggled with the aftermath. The rain's unrelenting rhythm was a haunting soundtrack to her crumbling world. Days later, Chloe returned with damning evidence, photos of Laura and Elliot, and one final image of Ethan, her ex-husband, watching from afar. He knows, Chloe stated, her tone cold and direct. He's waiting. You need to leave, Laura, before it's too late. Laura's heart ached at the thought of leaving Elliot, but she knew Chloe was right. With trembling hands, Laura wrote her farewell, a brief letter filled with regret. Elliot, I don't know if you'll forgive me, but I hope you live a life I cannot destroy. Driving away from the villa, Laura didn't look back. The stillness of the lake reflected none of the chaos stirring beneath the surface. She carried the heavy realization that some storms could never truly pass. Meanwhile, the story continued. Days later, Chloe received a call. Ethan's voice came through, calm yet chilling. She's gone, isn't she? But Elliot is still there. Do you think I'll just forget? The line went dead, leaving Chloe with an unsettling silence. Laura may have escaped, but the shadow of her choices, and Ethan's intent, cast a foreboding cloud over what was to come.